This is the first lecture of the modern period of philosophy. In order to understand modern philosophy's emphasis on the question of how do you know that you know something, or the issues of epistemology, we need to understand a little bit of the context surrounding that period of time. Aristotle's texts had only recently been recovered from the Muslim world. They had lain dormant and hidden from our Western civilization for nearly 1,500 years. Somehow, he was able to legitimize observation as a means for obtaining knowledge in the intellectual circles. But that wasn't the only thing. The church's power declined somewhat, and it was no longer the sole source of employment for people. Mercantilism had gained strength around the city-states of Italy, and certain families had developed businesses that they employed others. There was an atmosphere of free thinking away from the grips of an authoritative church. With the growth in the economy, there was construction, and these wealthy mercantile families developed tall-story buildings in the Renaissance to house their supplies of goods for sale. In the construction, they had to dig deep foundations, and what they found were the remnants of the classical past. They pieced together the classical past by means of observation. In addition to that, there were new technological tools available to extend the human eye. This was to see the smallest of things through the microscope and the most distant objects through a telescope. There were some transitional philosophers in this period. Nicholas of Cusa was still grounded in some of Plato's ideas. He said that the world was a copy of God. It was an animated whole. He wanted to avoid persecution of the church, however, because if you say that the world and God are similar in essence, that is a pantheism, and this would be heretical. To avoid this, Cusa said that the essence of things is different than the essence of God. Machiavelli was a political philosopher in the secular world who said that the state should be absolutely free from the domination of the church in politics, in science, and in religion. His work advocated that if a leader could not be loved, at least the leader should be feared. In order to hold power, power must be held at all costs. And some of his work was the impetus for the unification of Italy. Pascal was a free thinker as well, and in the faith of a rise of atheism, he comes up with a wager. He says, when reason is neutral on the issue of God's existence, the balance of positive and negative consequences of believing versus disbelieving in God should psychologically compel us to believe that a God exists. Now, what exactly does he mean by this? Well, if you believe in God when in fact he does not exist, there are no consequences for that. However, if you do not believe in God when in fact he does exist, there are big consequences for that, and he says that should be enough to compel us to believe. Observation in science begins with astronomy after the development of the telescope, and we see Da Vinci, Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and Newton all working together to devise for us a new conception of the world and the universe. Leonardo da Vinci was an inventor, a thinker, and an artist. His image here is the Vitruvian Man, and this harkens back to the classical time of Vitruvius, who was a theoretician of architecture, who looked at the works of Protagoras and accepted that man is the measure of all things. Copernicus was the scientist who claimed that the earth moved around the sun. It wasn't the other way around. We were not the center of heaven's gaze. His inspiration, he says, comes from the ancients, and this is some of his writing. Some maintain that the earth is stationary. But Philolaus, the Pythagorean, says that it revolves in a circle about the fire of the elliptical, like the sun and the moon. Heraclitus of Pontus and Elephantus, the Pythagorean, make the earth move, not changing its position, however, confined in its falling and rising around its own center in the manner of a wheel. Taking this as a starting point, I began to consider the mobility of the earth. Galileo legitimized Copernicus by observing the movement of the 4 moons of Jupiter around that heavenly body. In today's understanding of the earth and its placement in the universe, we see it as a tiny blue pixel, as the late Carl Sagan has said. The earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of this pixel on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner, how frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatreds. Our posturing, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe are challenged by this point of pale light. The idea that human beings are somehow insignificant in the context of the grand forces of nature led to a philosophy of determinism, that we had no free will at all. Just like the heavenly bodies that were moved by the larger forces of nature, we, as much smaller bodies, are also conditioned by those same forces of nature. And so the idea of free will was challenged at the beginning of the Renaissance, and is to this day. Kepler was one who described and predicted the elliptical movements of the planets. And he used a model that inscribed one pure form into another in order to determine the orbits. He says in his work that the distances of the planets from the sun are determined by the 5 regular solids if one supposed that a planet's orbit was circumscribed about one solid and inscribed by another. Isaac Newton made his observations and argued that in spite of all of the mechanical motions that he had devised, that God still existed. He says that God went to great measures in making the universe as self-sustaining as it is, and this reflects intelligent design rather than a blind nature force. In spite of his observations, he maintained a belief in God. With observation as a legitimate means toward gaining knowledge, it was Sir Francis Bacon who decided that a method of science ought to be standardized. His inductive method of science is from his work called Novum Organum, and he says that matter rather than forms, and these are the Platonic forms he refers to, should be the object of our attention, he said we must devise a new method of science. Now, René Descartes was faced with the rise in atheism, the idea that man had no free will, we were simply determined, and he did not accept this. René Descartes was a Catholic apologist who did want to preserve the idea of freedom, morality, and God in philosophy. In addition, he wanted to have knowledge grounded upon something other than observation. Now, why was this? Observation is an inductive method of thinking and is only probable in its conclusions. Why? Well, let's say you observe many thousands of times that swans are white. Your conclusion, swans are white, is only probable because on the next observation you might observe a black swan, which would mean this would be the counterexample to all previous observations. Founding all of knowledge on probable inductive observations was not what Descartes wanted for philosophy. He wanted a system that was necessary, that if the premises were true, it would be impossible to find a false conclusion. He wanted a deductive method of knowledge to ground philosophy upon. He begins and discovers analytic geometry, and this is a step toward the kind of model that he wants for his other descriptions in philosophy. One caution, though, he wants to avoid the persecution of the church, and he certainly remembers what happened to Galileo, so he's careful. While he doesn't think that religion should stem the tide of science, he also does not think that we are determined by a mechanistic universe. We do have free will. We do have moral choice, and we are responsible, and there is a God, according to Descartes. Well, he has his project cut out for him, and that is to discover a firm foundation of absolute certainty upon which to build his objective system of knowledge. How does he begin? Well, he wants to avoid prosecution by the church, but he begins with a profound doubt. He doubts everything that his observations give to him. And this might be things like observing an oar in the water. It appears bent, but it truly is not. Or a road that moves in the distance to a point, but truly it stays the same width even at that furthest distance. Observations, he says, cannot yield us a full knowledge. If we doubt even our own existence by observing our hands, or how is this avoiding a lunacy? This is a criticism of Descartes. The question of mathematics. Well, Descartes said it's possible that an evil genius could deceive him even about the simple truths of mathematics. Could anything be certain? Well, he says, I cannot doubt that it is me who is doing the doubting. This is the first fundamental principle that he relies upon. Ergo cogito sum. I think, therefore I am. Now, the knowledge that it is he who is doing the doubting does not come from observation, and he reasons that thinking is a different substance than extended matter. The next step in his process toward proofs of objects is that a realization that I am imperfect, of course. If we had full knowledge, we wouldn't be questioning everything. But this is not the point. He says that I would not realize my own imperfection if I did not have a prior notion of perfection in my mind. You wouldn't know you were imperfect if you didn't know what perfection was already. Being imperfect, you could not be, nor I could be, the cause of the idea of perfection. Descartes reasons that the cause of the idea of perfection lies outside of his own mind, and this is his causal proof of God. Since every effect has a cause, it must be God that caused the idea of perfection in me. Now, God, being the perfect being, is not an evil deceiver. This is the next step in his proof of objects. Therefore, when I look at an object, what I see is what I get. God would not deceive me about that. And we come to the last step. Objects do exist. Let's give a little recap. First, he doubts his observations and comes to the conclusion that it is he who is doubting through the process of thinking. He knows he's imperfect and does not cause the idea of perfection in himself, that God exists, that God is not an evil deceiver, and that what he observes is what he is actually seeing. He makes the claim for other ideas as innate. He says that ideas of self, identity, substance, and God are in us as we are born. So he dispels the evil genius, and he knows that Galileo's sightings of the moon